Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDxLondon experts in under 10 minutes. In this week's Climate Curious, we're asking, now that China's global emissions growth has started to fall, why is no one celebrating? To help us unpick this huge climate story, we have the founder of Fix the News, solutions journalist Angus Hervey. He reveals why the world's largest fossil fuel emitter has decided to change its ways and gives some pointers as to why this isn't front page news. On the untold story of the world's biggest emitter turning a huge corner, here's Angus Hervey. Stay curious.
One thing begins with a C. It is China, which is the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room. Hands down, the biggest story of 2025. And let me try and explain to you why it's such an important story. Since Paris in 2016, China has been responsible for about 90% of global emissions growth. 90%. So if you stripped China out, the rest of the world's emissions over the last decade have essentially flatlined, which is amazing. It means that all of the activism and Greta and the battles and the protests and all of the shouting, it kind of worked. We stopped emissions from going up. It worked everywhere except for China. Because while we were all arguing and shouting and getting angry with the people, with the fossil fuel interests, China added the equivalent of 5 Germanys to the global emissions ledger. So, and China didn't care what Greta Thunberg was saying. China didn't care about which banks were signing up to net zero pledges and which ones weren't. None of that would have made any difference to what China did over that decade. So China was kind of
why not? What's going on with China? I feel like this is like something that maybe people are supposed to understand, but I don't understand. I don't know what is so different about China compared to everyone else. Maybe that's a bad question. I don't know, but just out of interest, we can cut it out.
The Chinese Communist Party has a completely different set of incentives and motivations and stresses on it. And what is happening in the West is largely irrelevant, certainly with regards to energy, in terms of what China is planning to do. China's main priority is to create energy security and energy abundance. And over the last decade, China decided that the way to do that was to build a bucket load of coal plants and get them running around the clock. But at the same time, China was also taking a bet on renewables. And what happened is that last year is the year that it flipped. China's emissions have now been flat or falling for 18 months. And it looks very, very likely, we're still waiting for the final data, but unless something really dramatic happens, China's emissions are going to decline over the full year for 2025. And that's not because China's economy tanked, but because, as we talked about earlier, the structure of their energy system has started to fundamentally change.
Globally,
Coal dropped from 59% of their electricity to 53% in just 2 years. And remember, this is the country that accounts for a third of all carbon emissions. In the first half of 2025, their fossil demand in power generation fell by 2%. That's staggering. And that should have been the main story in climate everywhere, but of course it wasn't.
Okay, and are the Chinese coal plants in China? Sorry, again, maybe a stupid question, but in my mind, I'm trying to picture what is this? Do they have coal plants in Germany or like in other places around the world, or is it all just based in China? China's doing stuff in China.
The majority. There's only 2 countries in the world that are still building coal plants. Those countries are China and India. Nowhere else is building coal plants. Everywhere else is shutting coal plants down. China does have some coal plants that it's tried to invest in overseas in places, certainly in Asia, but increasingly less so. More importantly, the coal plants that China is building, China built a record amount of coal plants in 2025, but it's just not switching those coal plants on as much because increasingly wind and solar are starting to eat into coal plants' share because they provide cheaper electricity.
Okay, so they've decided now that the best bet is renewables because of the stuff you were talking about in the last narrative change point around the geopolitical movement of the industry around energy?
I think a better word is just security.
Security, right.
Yeah, China doesn't want to be importing coal, producing coal, and it doesn't want to be importing oil and be reliant on other countries. It wants to have its own, be responsible for its own energy. And I also just want to kind of give a bit of context here. China added 330 gigawatts of solar and wind in 2025. That is...
What, is that a lot? That sounds like
is insane. I'll give you,
a lot.
It's a lot. I'll tell you, let me try and explain it. In May, in 1 month in 2025, China installed 92 gigawatts of solar, which is 230 million solar panels in a single month, which is the same amount that Germany has installed basically in its entire history. And China did that in 1 month in May.
I think maybe sometimes the thing that is hard for us to wrap our minds around when it comes to the two things, I think, when it comes to China that are difficult to wrap our mind around. One is the sheer scale of what we're talking about. It's just so much bigger than any reference point we have. And I think the other thing is just at least for me, is that you, and it's probably a very Western perspective, because you feel complicated towards China. And so, when you asked that question earlier, I was just like, well, because China's a dictatorship. In my mind, like, that's the easy answer.
It's goodies
but
and
it's obviously
baddies,
not.
right? Yeah, it's
not that easy. Yeah. It's not that simple, because, like, at this point, I would say that, like, democracy is not that cut and dry anywhere.
Yeah, right. Good point.
I don't think...
But maybe that has nothing to do with it. Maybe that, when it comes to this part of the conversation.
I think we can chew gum and walk at the same time. I think it's possible on the one hand to say that dictatorship is an abhorrent form of government and certainly not something that we want. And I think it's also okay to say that the world's biggest dictatorship is also the one that is kind of saving us right now when it comes to climate change. That's quite a difficult thing to hold in your head, but it's not impossible.
Yes. I agree. I think that is what people struggle with. I think that's certainly what I've struggled with, is this kind of this trying to hold two things that feel contradictory, difficult. But at the same time, this is a better outcome. Like, it's better that the world's largest dictatorship is peaking its emissions and turning towards renewables rather than doubling down on fossil.
I think that you're onto something there. I think that you'd say, look, what world would we want? And I'd say I would want the world where the largest fossil fuel emitter in the world, the one that's been responsible for all of the fossil fuel emissions growth over the last decade, well, almost all of it, I'd want to be in the world where that player has decided to change its ways. I'd rather that player, which accounts for 1/3 of global emissions, decide to change its ways, than the United States be, some green savior, because the United States is only 10% of global carbon emissions. And so if you had to choose between which one of those is the bad guys, I'd choose the United States to be the bad guy.
And interesting when you talk about narrative change, right? It's like, what narratives do you actually want to change? And the practicalities of those changes happening, I guess, can be difficult for us to grapple with in our minds. But also, like, on a practical level, like, it's fundamentally important. Like, we are actually all in it together. So it is, everybody has to be part of the change, otherwise it doesn't work, right?
I think that's right. And I also think, the atmosphere doesn't care where the carbon comes from. Right. It doesn't care whether the carbon comes from a Chinese coal plant or an American coal plant or a British gas turbine. It's all the same as far as the environment, as far as the atmosphere is concerned. And I think, the fact that China, the biggest player, is starting to reduce its emissions, that's the story of 2025, not the United States.
Thanks for listening to this quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDxLondon. Until next time,
stay curious.